Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. As Vermonters, we place high value on our natural resources, from the air we breathe to the water we drink. As a state, we invest both time and money to protect these fragile resources, particularly our rivers and lakes. So our focus this afternoon is to update you on some of the state water quality programs and issues. I want to welcome two guests who've been with us before. Joining me are Marley Roop from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and Laura DiPietro from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. It's great to see you again. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Judy.
Now, one of Vermont's most significant water quality issues involves something called TMDL on Lake Champlain. And Marley, can you remind us what that means?
Hate to use another acronym, but unfortunately we use it all the time. TMDL stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. Basically, that means the amount of a pollutant that a water body can handle and still meet the state water quality standards. And a pollutant might be phosphorus, as it is in the case of Lake Champlain. It also might be temperature, the amount of temperature that a water body can assimilate and still stay cool enough, for example, to support a cold water fishery. So a TMDL just simply means the amount of the pollutant that the water can handle and still do what we want it to do, allow us to swim in it and drink it.
And so how's that figured out?
It's calculated through a model. It's a very involved modeling process that takes the data that we've gathered for years and years of the water quality going into the lake, and also the water quality of the lake itself, samples of water that are taken from the tributaries going into the lake, as well as from places inside of the lake itself. And then we look at that data over time and look at the amount of phosphorus that's going into the lake and calculate the total amounts.
And so where are we on the timeline of getting this TMDL done that we've been talking about for so long, Laura?
Well, the TMDL is, in theory, going to be released next spring. So what we're doing is working right now really closely with EPA, the Department of Environmental Conservation Agency of Agriculture, and we're trying to reach out to stakeholders. We've been doing this for quite a while with the agricultural stakeholders. And basically, we're right at the point now where we're trying to figure out and understand what the scenarios might be that are scenarios that we'd like to present publicly to the citizens of Vermont as options for fixing the lake. And that's going to start happening in October. And at the end of the show, we'll show a slide that demonstrates these public meetings coming up. The input will be collected all throughout the winter, and then in the spring, as I mentioned, the plan will be finalized. Once the plan is finalized, which basically says, you know, this watershed can contribute this much and that watershed can contribute that much, then we have to have a strategy in each area to figure out how we actually get there. So that we have a year from the release date to figure out what our implementation strategy will be.
And so I think it's fair to say that most of us don't understand what models do or they mean, or don't take the time to really understand it. So what we often really want to know is, what's this going to mean for me?
Well, one of the important things to understand with the work that we've been doing is that it's not just limited to agriculture. Laura and I work with the agricultural community, but this model also looked at other non-point sources, other sources of phosphorus that are running into the lake from other areas, impervious surfaces, stormwater runoff, municipalities, our small towns, our back roads where the sediment erodes so often in some of our heavy rain flows. So this model was looking at a lot more than just agriculture. And it's important also for us to understand that this is just in the trial phase. This is where we're looking at the data, we're looking at these numbers, we're looking at the ideas, and really, really anxious for the public input to help us mold where we go from here.
And so tell me a little bit about something called the AWG.
The Agricultural Working Group. And so basically, the TMDL, we knew we had to revise it. We knew we weren't meeting the targets based on existing rules and policies that we have. And so we knew that, at least in ag and in other sectors too, but we're just talking ag right now, we had to do something different. And so rather than just come up with new rules or policies, we went out and we did a roadshow, Marley and I, last fall, all throughout the winter. And in the spring, we put out a request saying, farmers, ag service providers, if you're interested in being on a smaller work group, to really figure out what are the right next steps to do so that we can improve water quality leaving agricultural lands, we want your input. And so we've worked all the way from February till now, coming up with ideas, and we'll talk about a few of those today on the show, that the farm group came up with to help give us the right advice to be able to say, this is the direction we'd like to go.
And so what have you heard? What have you come up with? What does the group come up with?
Well, they had three very, very key priorities that were front and center before we even got down to the nitty-gritty. One was that all farms within the state need to be meeting what are called our accepted agricultural practices. Those are the state regulations that all farms must meet, and that's not just dairy farmers. That's anyone who has a few beef, a few horses, llamas, emus, chickens, pigs, whatever. There are state regulatory requirements that all of these producers need to be meeting, and compliance with that is something that they felt very strongly about, making sure that we have the resources to enforce that. The second thing was that things be flexible, that one size does not fit all when you're dealing with agriculture.
Exactly.
We can't just make a regulation that everybody has to meet, because it doesn't make sense in every situation. And so making sure that these programs were adaptable and site-specific was important. And then the third thing was making sure that the resources were available. There are just simply not enough people to go out and visit with 4,000 or 5,000 farmers in the state to make sure they are meeting the accepted agricultural practices, and even understand what those are, and understanding the benefits of them also to the farmers themselves.
And so, Laura, what are some of the specific details?
Well, some of the areas we really focused on were the discrepancies between the current standards. So medium and large farms have pretty rigorous standards at this point for a myriad of concepts. In the small farms, there were a few areas that just seemed like the right direction to move. And so one example would be buffers along streams. The current standard is that small farms have 10-foot wide buffers, except at points of runoff, which is where all the water might leave a field, that would be 25 feet. That's the current standard. And on medium and large farms, it's 25 feet everywhere. Well, the agricultural landscape in corn, for example, is no different no matter what size you are. And so that standard wasn't really based on a water quality concept, rather it was based on management of resources and abilities. And so for water quality, the idea is to bring everybody up to this 25-foot everywhere standard. However, the flexibility is what the farmers really wanted, and they thought, well, if you can demonstrate that you're a good farm, you're following the rules, and you have a nutrient management plan that really works and is tailored to your farm, that you could have what they called smart buffers, which is basically, if the water doesn't leave the field there, if the land actually goes up adjacent to the stream there, your buffer doesn't need to be as wide. And so to have these kind of
flexibility that we were talking
flexible
about.
buffers, yeah, just sensible buffers, smart buffers is what they would like. But if you can't meet the standards, then that opportunity wouldn't be afforded to you. So it's about demonstrating good management. So that was one area that they thought, getting something more equal, but also adding flexibility for those good farmers. The other area is farm certification. So this group really felt strongly that if you have a livestock, you have a responsibility to take care of it and manage the manure that comes from it, no matter what size you are. So, you know, there are 2 horses in a backyard. They have to follow accepted agricultural practices. And one of the things we learned when we went around the state was these type of farms, hobby or gentleman farms, don't necessarily know that they are a farm that should be following water quality standards by the state. And so as a certification process annually, it's a questionnaire that describes, you know, are you following your buffers? What do you do with your manure? Some questions that help you understand what the rules are, and then you can make a decision of whether you're complying. And there'd be, you know, at the bottom something that says, if you need technical assistance, call this non-regulatory number, and these folks can help you. So it was a way to kind of just get people in the door, understanding what the rules are, and aware that they're supposed to follow them.
And so have you gotten feedback from people who say, oh, I had no idea that I had to follow these kinds of rules?
We have, and one of the things that we find very difficult, and we'll have to work on if this moves in that direction, is how we do outreach to that particular sector. You know, the dairy farms, we know where they are. Most of the beef, you know, anything that's fairly of reasonable size that's doing market trading. But backyard operations, we have a lot more difficulty identifying where those are. And so we'll have to come up with an outreach campaign for sure.
And also, too, people might not realize that even 2 horses or 1 horse or an animal in your backyard can make an impact on the watershed.
Oh, it certainly can, especially when there isn't enough land for the animal to actually graze off of. So you're bringing in supplemental feed and you have a bare ground below it. So
the bare ground is really an issue that I think a lot of people don't realize when they have just a few animals, is the erosion that horses or sheep or beef can cause along the edge of a stream bank can have a major water quality impact, because phosphorus sticks to soil. So whenever the soil is eroding into the water, it's taking phosphorus with it, and that's all running downstream.
So there were 2 more areas that we talked with the farmers about. soil erosion, as you had just mentioned, current standards for small farms are 2 times a tolerable limit, which is the amount of soil that's produced in a year. So you could lose twice as much soil as is naturally produced. And the standard for medium and large is you can lose as much as you gain. And so now applying that standard across the board for all farms is that what has been proposed. And we're looking at maybe, you know, there's opportunities where there's no water nearby and maybe that standard shouldn't apply there, but certainly where there is water, to keep the erosion at a tolerable loss. The last thing is nutrient management plan. I keep mentioning that nutrient management plan may be the ticket to allow more flexibility. Right now, small farms have to do what we call nutrient management planning, which is basically take your soil tests, apply manure or other materials like that at agronomic rates, but they don't have to have something written down and structured to think about and to demonstrate that they've done planning. And so this would get them into that arena, which is where the medium and the large farms are, of doing holistic farm nutrient management planning, thinking about what's coming into your farm and what's going out of your farm and balancing everything.
Is it just a matter of education?
I think so. That was the biggest piece that farmers kept saying, education, education, education is really what we need to do.
And some of it is also some technical assistance. Doing these nutrient management plans, some of it requires some calculations that a lot of farmers don't know about. So providing some of, again, education, but also the real technical assistance to go along with it.
And there are some existing programs too.
Oh, there are a lot of them, and there's programs to help to do some of this work, but also programs and people that provide education. UVM Extension, the conservation districts that are also outreach and education to farmers.
Do you run into farmers who don't think that they should be following these rules, or don't believe that they want to follow these rules, or they're intrusive?
Unfortunately, there certainly are people who feel that way about them, and that's why enforcing the regulations that we have is so important. It's not fair to farmers who work very hard to meet the rules and do the right thing for others to be able to not do it. So that's an important part of our program to try and work towards water quality improvement, is enforcing the regulations we have.
And so all of this is still tentative. What are some of the plans for making things more definite?
Well, today we'd like to talk to everybody and let them know what the Ag Work Group came up with and what we're doing with that information. Just to provide a little more background, these Ag Work Group recommendations that I just described are going to, we have provided the 2 agencies these recommendations to the EPA, saying that in the next TMDL that they're developing now, these are what we're proposing to be the new baseline or the new revisions to the accepted agricultural practices. Again, it's not set in stone, but if we go on that assumption and then model it, we can see, can we meet our targets in agriculture with these recommendations? In areas there may be, we're not able to meet them. Some of the lake segments are more impaired than the others, specifically North Lake and South Lake. And in those areas, we may have to come up with new additional incentive programs or other resources to try and demonstrate that we have a reasonable assurance that we're going to actually be able to do this job, which is what EPA needs to count on from us.
And so what happens from here?
Well, the next thing we're going to be doing is some pretty extensive public outreach. There is a series of meetings that are scheduled for October that the Department of Environmental Conservation is going to be holding with the Agency of Agriculture and other partners to get out into the public and present some of this information and get feedback. And those dates are set for the last 2 weeks of October. But in addition, Laura and I will be doing, again, another round robin of meetings with the agricultural community in the area. And we really want to encourage anyone who has a group of farmers or some kind of need or desire to meet with us and talk about some of this, to let us know. We'd be more than happy to come out and visit with the farming community wherever they are to make it easy and have a good discussion on this.
We also expect the legislative session this year, these recommendations, because they're going to be put into the TMDL as proposed, if they work out and they meet the goals, then they would fall into becoming a regulatory requirement. And so that discussion throughout the legislative session would happen as that process of proposing a bill and seeing if it goes to law.
It sounds like, though, these are the kinds of issues that are just going to sort of be ongoing and could be monitored for years and years to make sure that it's happening or tweaked along the way?
Well, that's an important part of the TMDL itself, is looking at the numbers that exist right now and looking at the improvements we've made in the last few years, and then where we're going to go forward and how we can watch it as it goes along, and use some adaptive management and make changes where we need to. Make sure it makes sense.
But even people who don't live on a farm should pay attention to this information.
Absolutely, because as I said before, this addresses a lot more than agriculture. Anyone who owns land, who lives on the land, who is part of the local community, contributes to water quality in some way, either positively or negatively. So we want everyone to be aware of the impacts that they have on this and the potential for contributing.
I want to thank you for joining me today. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX-TV.